Hey guys, Leanna here. As promised yesterday, we're going to look at the concept of toxic masculinity. And before we start in on this, I want to clarify my reasons for talking about this. As I said yesterday, I deal with terms like this just to sort of explain to people what these things sort of are so we can have a certain number of, common terms and good stuff like that. So that when we're throwing these words around, we kind of have a common understanding of what they mean. And I've hit a roadblock with this term, toxic masculinity. It's thrown around a lot, not just on the left, which is interesting, but it's a term that I think sits the intersection point of I don't know what toxic masculinity is, but I'll know when I see it. And you keep using this word. I do not think it means what you think it means. And no matter what source I look up to try to get a definition on the internet of toxic masculinity that I can share, I run up against this element of political bias that or personal bias that I find makes it not useful as a defining tool, because a good definition is something that can actually define a terminology, not define it for the purposes of exclusively of the person using it. And I find that toxic masculinity, by its very nature of what it is, gets used that way. It gets used as a way to reject elements of being male, male performance, as some people call it. No, that's not sexual. It's a performative gender concept. And, various things like that. I find it's a way for people to reject the things they personally don't like because it makes them feel bad. And this is the same issue we encounter in, women's rights movements and feminist discussion as a whole. You have to be very careful to separate, something that may make you as a person personally insecure versus something that you as an analyst can objectively say is showing societal harm. And I think there's an argument to be made regarding toxic masculinity that there are some social indicators. One is the high incarceration rate for men compared to women. I think that's an example of toxic masculinity that has a definite real world outcome. The other is the increased suicide rate among men, especially middle-aged men. And so those are two, real world things that we can actually point to and go, okay, there's something connected to the experience of being male that is uniquely not a good outcome. And we need to look at this and try to figure out preventative measures to try to bring these numbers down. But that's not what people tend to talk about when they talk about toxic masculinity. You can see it here that toxic masculinity is wrapped up in the idea of what it means to be a man. And this is one of the better articles. It's done by Dr. Nerdlove. One of the better ones. As I say, now he's a layman. We can see in the disclaimer here, not really a doctor. This is too long. But he's not a doctor. That's just his name. Here we go. These ideal manly traits actively harm men and women. That's the idea behind toxic masculinity. Now, that isn't what toxic masculinity always was. It's what it's seen as now. Back in the 1970s through the 1990s, toxic masculinity was something used by the men's movement. And unfortunately, the best source I could get for it is a really ugly, nasty screen that's probably hard to read. This is a guy who's devoted his career to writing about it, so I pulled it up on Wikipedia. The mythopoetic men's movement, as they called it, had these elements of toxic masculinity, the muting of the male voice, emotional damage about men being the problem, men being discouraged from expressing their emotions. This one has carried on until today. What the mythopoetic men's movement claimed toxic masculinity was the moving away from male bonding and men spending more time with their wives than with each other. And so the concept is a perpetually moving goalpost that makes these discussions really, really difficult. Whenever you're using this terminology, it makes, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire because it means something slightly different to every person who uses it. And that's why I don't use the term often. I'll use it in reference to what someone else will say. But I don't personally, I prefer to talk about things on, a case-by-case basis. The violence issue. Are men, I won't say encouraged to be violent, so much anymore, but there is an assumption that men are just, quote unquote, naturally violent as opposed to women, which, is not true. If you grow up in a house with sisters, violence breaks out. But it's these social paradigms that is this it, or is it something deeper? That's what people are studying, but we can do that without the term toxic masculinity. The suicide issue definitely tied into men being discouraged from asking for help. Women are encouraged to be emotional, empathic communicators more than men. I don't think anyone denies that. So there's one that's much more simple. But if you look at these articles, the examples they use, the craziest one I found came from, this is the Geek Feminism Wiki. So, the idea that a real man cannot be victim of abuse and talking about it is shameful. Fine. Yeah, that's a good one to bring up. But then, though not reinforced much in fictional media, in real life, it is widely expected that a man would abandon his pregnant girlfriend and is incapable and or unwilling to take responsibility. That's a weird one because I don't think it's necessarily expected. I think that people are like, you take care of your kids. To me, that's the one I've heard. That's an odd one. So, once you see something like that, it's like, can we trust the rest of these? Well, we have to look at them more stringently, but the, real man cannot be a victim of abuse, big one. Absolutely big one. Other ones I've showed you here. This one, more boys grow up without fathers as their struggles are continually overlooked by a world anxious to promote the welfare of women. The stereotypical hyper-aggressive and sex-crazed man became more common and more feared. That was something that was an issue in the 80s and the 90s. Maybe we've still got a hangover for it now. But again, not really terribly helpful, This article defines toxic masculinity as emotionally stunted and obsessed with sex and violence. They left out binge drinking and fart jokes. So I'm sure you start to see the problem, but then you get into, this is just horrible, and I'm sorry because this guy's, I think the most objective voice I've read on the subject. He's in a collection of voices that actually just write books on the thing, and they don't have, they're not blogging. But you scroll down here in an article on toxic masculinity, we come to and this, I read this and went, did we have to go there? Really? Did we have to go there? But let's examine this because we're going here. Gamergate, doom, provides an excellent example of men who don't fit the traditional definitions of manly. Does it? Really? Because, to me, the whole misogynist neckbeard thing was totally hitting a toxically masculine stereotype. But okay, this is evolved. Here we go. Who, by their own words, are frequently oppressed and bullied by manlier men, jocks, preps, bros, chads, etc. That wasn't necessarily what I heard. I heard that, yes, there was bullying, not necessarily by men. But they also talked about the fact that politics was coming in and making things difficult for them. And yes, it was politics of gender, but men, in the conversations I had, it was not necessarily, men picked on me. I'm intimidated by other men, by manlier men. But let's move on. Yet are eager to marginalize others by the same dictates. One of the oft-toted, and I could make a terrible joke about dictate. Those of you who know the joke are probably snickering. One of the oft-toted reasons why SJWs are so unwelcome is because gaming has become a place for men to be men. In essence, the only place where they can validate their masculinity, which society otherwise denies them. I disagree with this. I think that what gaming validates is personhood, not masculinity. I think that gaming validates, because I play games and I tend to stick myself to single player games instead of multiplayer games for this reason. I play games so that I can get successes, and being a good person is rewarded in the games I play. I don't like games where you're rewarded for being an asshole, because there's enough of that in real life. And I think it's less an issue of masculinity, because I found that a lot of these the people that they're defining as gamergaters, which is a very broad term as well. I mean, a gamergater is anyone on any given day, just somebody you don't like and want to throw an insult at, myself included, which is why I prick up my ears at this stuff. I don't think that validation of masculinity is really the core. I don't think that gamers want to feel like men. I think it's far deeper than that. I think gamers want to feel like people. And the stuff I've heard is language of dehumanization, not language of emasculation. I mean, one of the big complaints about the SJWs that gamergaters make is the fact that they are so violent in some of their metaphors. They are so aggressive, and things like go die in a fire, and the directly aggressive insult tactics and shame tactics that come out of these SJWs. That to me is what I've heard the complaint being. It's not necessarily the outcome. I don't think anybody objects to diversity. It's the okay, there's a lunatic fringe that objects to diversity. Let's be quite honest with that. That does exist. But to me, it's been more a hey, I don't want to be this person you're claiming I am. Let's go on. As a result, they recreate the same system that's isolated and alienated them and turn their oppressors' beliefs and tactics into virtues. Huh? Men can't possibly disagree with them unless they've been suborned by the sexual wiles of a manipulative woman. Trans people are inherently either delusional or actively lying about their gender identity. Games shouldn't have to change from the macho dictates of the FPS shooter or the fighting game, because games that aren't about killing or fucking are walking simulators or SJW pussy bait. Women are castrating bitches and whores. Non-gamergate supporting men are cucks, fags, and betas. Internet tough guys are lionized, and the dictates of the group must be enforced through harassment and violence. I think this is confusing Chan and Reddit culture, which looks the same whether you're talking about Gamergate or you're talking about Game of Thrones or any other topic under the sun, movies, television, needlepoint. Is there a needlepoint subreddit? Probably. But this sort of stuff, other than the walking simulators, um, isn't it has nothing to do with Gamergate per se. It's the mediums this thing erupted on. It's the fact that a huge portion of this discussion is done on Reddit, Chan, and Twitter, all of which are services that have pre-existing cultures that not just allow but encourage that kind of talk as a form of catharsis, performance, if you will, if we're going to stick to the performative theory. People say these things because they're not things that you're supposed to say in, the real life, for lack of a better term. There's this idea that everybody actually feels this way, and this is just being more honest by some. In other cases, you hear a lot of they're just shit posting, which means they don't really mean it. And it's interesting to me that we have such a disconnect between, and to me, what I've observed, not that I necessarily agree that this works, but I find that a lot of the people on Chan boards and Reddit boards are quite sensitive people in their own worlds. They're quite introverted, and they say these things to try to build up their resilience to it, that it hurts less if they're around people who say this stuff all the time. And one could say that that's toxic masculinity. And I guess it's connected to masculine communication styles, but not really. I mean, traditional masculinity is, wrapped up in the whole white knight concept that, and so it's much more complicated than that. And, internet tough guys are lionized, and the dictates of the group must be enforced through harassment and violence. I don't know that I can agree with that because, the lone former professional athlete in the whole thing that's been trotted out again and again and again has been on the anti-Gamergate SJW side, their football player. And this is a football player that laughs at women when they're trying to make a point. This is someone who, uses the language of tough guys to say why, we should support gays, we should support various things. And I agree that support for gay rights, trans rights, inclusivity of all kinds is important, but I don't think we necessarily need the language of a locker room to do it. And so I'd have to disagree that this is an inherently Gamergate trait, and I find it really interesting that this came up in a discussion of toxic masculinity, because then we're into Terry Crews, who speaks openly about the absurdity of gender roles and the need to abandon toxic masculinity. I don't think that anybody believes that the gender roles we currently have are anything but absurd. High-heeled shoes are absurd. Neckties are absurd. There's nothing practical about any of this stuff, but a necktie is, immediately associated with the male sphere. High-heeled shoes and bows in your hair are immediately associated with femininity. And these are the things we have to sort of talk about, which is why, women entertainers from, Marlene Dietrich to Madonna to Lady Gaga have incorporated neckties and performative male dress into some of their stage routines and music videos. There's a whole artistic tradition of defying these things, glam rock in the 1980s to go to the other side. And so I think that, you guys can sort of see just from that little breakdown there, toxic masculinity is often in the eye of the beholder. Now, does this mean we completely throw out the term? Well, normally this is the place I say no. But in this case, I think we really have to be very careful when we use the term toxic masculinity, that we're doing so unironically and doing so consciously. And that's true of any term, right? I mean, people shouldn't throw around feminist buzzwords either. And some would claim that toxic masculinity is a feminist buzzword, but it's really not. It only is part of the time. And I think we have to be very careful when we use this word. I think we need to use this term only when maybe dealing specifically with toxic effects of modern, Western masculinity, like the suicide discussion, like, men being so defined by their jobs that they get terribly depressed when they're unemployed. And I mean, I have a unique perspective on this in that, I'm one of those, my dad wanted a boy types. I'm the oldest, in, my biological family. And so I was the one that was expected to learn to play baseball and do all this boy stuff. And some of the stuff I really, really liked. Some of the other stuff I didn't like so much. The focus on toughness never worked for me, because then, you go and you hit that age where you're expected to play with other kids. And I was always much more comfortable playing with boys and girls because there was a certain level of roughhousing that I understood. Whereas I got around girls and I was seen as weird, right? And did that have anything to do with who I was as a person? No, that had everything to do with the skills and socializations that I was encouraged to have. And then, of course, any wedding or fancy event or anything where we were trying to put on a show, suddenly my parents would try to stuff me in a dress and I'd be absolutely miserable because a dress was, the complete antithesis of everything I got approval for every other day of the year. And so this is the sort of stuff that interests me in gender, and this is the sort of stuff that keeps me coming back to this, and this is the sort of stuff that I think, because I can sort of relate from that, unique background, and being born in the 1970s, I think that I have the benefit of remembering a time where things were much less gendered before, the pink section emerged in the toy store. And this whole, Disney princess thing came kicking up. And if you want toxic femininity, which I'm asked a lot on this topic, what's toxic femininity if there's toxic masculinity? Well, toxic femininity is the whole concept that no matter how accomplished you are, if you don't have a handsome prince by the end of the day, well, you're a failure. You haven't accomplished the primary female goal. Toxic femininity means that women are less likely to give guys who don't fit a certain physical appearance a chance, not because they don't think that this person has something to offer. They think that it's some concept of them as a woman that, oh, this is the best you could do. People are going to see you can't be taller than the man you're with, or you can't be more broad-shouldered than the man you're with, or anything like that. I'm taller than my husband. It's who cares? I mean, pretty much every fashion model on the planet is taller than their spouse or significant other, because these women are 6 feet tall. And it's funny because you tend to see a lot of models with men who don't fit the traditional, masculine gender role, because they've seen the politics and business of gender absolutely up close, and they know what garbage it is. And this is why we should talk about this stuff. But I'm really concerned based on trying to find just one place that can give me a decent definition of toxic masculinity without falling down the rabbit hole in some way or the other. I'm very concerned now that this term is so vague that it no longer has a use. So we're at the point where we need to define this term, not situationally, but objectively. And either we need to do that or we need to move on from this term, because this term is too elastic now. And when terms become too elastic, they cease to have any meaning and people just infer way too much, and then you get the messes that we have online. So hopefully this gave you guys something to think about. I was trying very hard to not be the last word, but people get disappointed if I don't, share my opinion. So that's it. That I think that based on the stuff I've looked at, it isn't easy to find out what this term means, and that minimizes its usefulness, I believe. I think a lot of people think they know what this term is, but the varying degrees of usage have led to some misunderstandings and a lot of upset. So we've got to watch it. And I can't believe I've talked for 26 freaking minutes on this. This is what a quagmire these topics end up being. But hopefully you found it informative. That's the least I can do.